Marco Polo survived a 24-year odyssey through deadly deserts to become the eyes and ears of Kublai Khan, ultimately writing a book that changed the map of the world. In January 1324, in Venice, an old, rich and respected merchant was dying. Friends, priests, and relatives had gathered by his bedside. They begged him to perform one last act, the most important one for the salvation of his soul, to confess his lies and retract all those incredible stories he had told throughout his life and had written down in his famous book. But the dying man, gathering his last ounce of strength, answered them with a phrase that went down in history. "I have not told half of what I saw." That man was Marco Polo. To his contemporaries, he was a fantasist, a teller of tall tales, Mr. Million, whose stories about giant palaces of gold, black stones that burned like firewood, and paper money seemed like the ravings of a madman. His book was read like a chivalric romance or a collection of fairy tales, placing it on the same level as legends about dragons and monsters. But who was he really? The greatest liar of all, who never traveled beyond Constantinople, as some skeptics claim, or the most perceptive observer of his time, the first to reveal to Europe the true magnitude and riches of the East. This is the story of an incredible 24-year odyssey, about a journey across the roof of the world and the deadly Gobi Desert toward the brilliant court of Kublai Khan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan. It is the tale of a merchant who became the eyes and ears of the Emperor of China, and about a book written in a Genoese prison that changed the map of the world and inspired Christopher Columbus on his own fateful voyage. In the mid-13th century, Venice was not just a city. It was the most serene republic, master of the Adriatic and the commercial gateway between Europe and the East. The city, built on wooden pilings in the middle of the lagoon, was a maze of canals, marble palaces, and damp, foggy alleys. Here, it smelled of salt, spices, rotting seaweed, and a lot of money. The Venetians were a nation of merchants, pragmatic people, eager for profit and incredibly enterprising, for whom the entire world was nothing more than a marketplace. It was precisely here, in 1254, that Marco Polo was born. Very little is known about his early childhood, but one fact defines his entire youth. He grew up as an orphan with a living father. His mother died when he was very young, and he had never seen his father, Niccolo Polo. A few months before Marco was born, in 1253, Niccolo Polo and his brother Maffeo, rich and ambitious merchants, committed an act typical of Venetians of that era, but fatal to their family. They loaded their ships with precious stones and goods, and set sail from Venice to Constantinople, and then to Crimea, to the trading post of Sudak. They expected to return in a year or two with profits, but they disappeared for 15 years. Marco grew up in the home of his aunt and uncle, receiving the classic education of a Venetian merchant gentleman. He did not learn Latin or philosophy, like Shakespeare or Newton. He learned the languages of commerce. He knew French and Italian, knew how to count in different currencies, could tell the quality of fabrics and spices, and knew about navigation and the structure of cargo ships. He was raised with the idea that risk is a noble thing if it brings profit. Every day, looking at the horizon of the Adriatic Sea, he must have wondered if his father was alive, or if his bones were already bleaching somewhere in the sands of Asia, like those of thousands of other merchants. Meanwhile, his father and uncle were on a journey that, on its own, would deserve a separate book. Upon arriving in Crimea, they successfully sold their goods, but their way back was cut off. A war broke out in the steppes of the Black Sea among the Mongol Khans of the Golden Horde. Returning by sea was dangerous. Going overland to the west was impossible, and the Polo brothers made a crazy and daring decision. If you cannot go back, you must go forward, to the east. They crossed the Volga, traveled through the steppes of Kazakhstan, and reached Bukhara, a wealthy trading city in Central Asia. There they were, trapped for 3 years due to local wars. It seemed they were doomed to spend the rest of their days far from home. But fate intervened in the form of an envoy from the great Kublai Khan, who was passing through Bukhara. Hearing about the strange foreigners from the west, the ambassador offered them an unprecedented deal. He guaranteed their safety and an escort if they agreed to go with him to the court of the great Khan, who had never seen Latins or Europeans, and was very eager to meet them. The Polo brothers accepted. A year-long journey through deserts and mountains to the very edge of the known world awaited them, and they made it. For the first time in history, Venetian merchants stood before Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire and future emperor of China. Kublai turned out not to be a bloodthirsty barbarian, but an enlightened and incredibly curious monarch. He asked the brothers about Europe, about the Pope, about the Christian faith and Western customs, and he gave them an important diplomatic mission. He asked them to return to Rome and deliver a message to the Pope, requesting that he send him 100 wise men versed in the 7 liberal arts, so they could demonstrate the superiority of the Christian faith over paganism, and also to bring him oil from the lamps of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. To guarantee their safety on the return trip, Kublai gave them a paisa, a golden tablet serving as a VIP passport and diplomatic credential. The person who possessed the paisa was under the personal protection of the Khan. People were obliged to give him horses, food, and lodging anywhere in the gigantic Mongol Empire. With this golden pass, the Polo brothers made the incredible journey back. In 1269, 15 years after their departure, Niccolo and Maffeo Polo returned to Venice. For Marco, who was already 15 years old at the time, that was like the resurrection of the dead. He saw his father for the first time. Before him stood not a simple merchant, but a man covered in the dust of the roads, speaking a mix of languages, dressed in strange oriental clothes, and telling stories about kingdoms that did not appear on any map. But their mission ran into an unexpected obstacle. Pope Clement IV had died, and the cardinals, immersed in intrigue, could not manage to elect a new one. The longest interregnum in history began in the Catholic Church. The Polo brothers waited 2 years. They could not return to the Khan without an answer from the Pope, as that would have been an insult. Those 2 years, from 1269 to 1271, were decisive for young Marco. He eagerly absorbed the stories of his father and his uncle. He listened about black stones that burn, about endless steppes, about palaces covered in pure gold. A fire ignited in his soul. He no longer wanted to be a desk-bound merchant in Venice. He wanted to see it for himself. And Niccolo Polo, seeing his son's sharp mind, observational skills, and bravery, made a decision. On the next trip, they would take Marco with them. Finally, in 1271, a new pope was elected, Pope Gregory X. The Polo brothers got an audience, but the result was disappointing. Instead of 100 wise men, the Pope could only assign them 2 Dominican monks, and these men, frightened by the difficulties and rumors of war in Armenia, fled at the first opportunity. Barely had the expedition reached the shores of Asia Minor. But the Polos had the main things: the Pope's letter, the oil from Jerusalem, and most importantly, the Khan's golden paisa. And they had a new companion. 17-year-old Marco Polo stepped onto the deck of the galley, saying goodbye forever to Venice as he knew it. He left as a young man full of romantic hopes. He did not know that he would return alone 24 years later, transformed into a grey-haired and tired man whom no one would recognize. He did not know that it would be his fate to walk across all of Asia, serve in the court of the most powerful man on earth, and see wonders that Europe would refuse to believe in for several more centuries. The journey began. They landed at the port of Ayas, in present-day Turkey, and pushed eastward into the unknown. The world Marco knew, the narrow canals of Venice, was left behind. Ahead lay endless spaces, full of dangers, bandits, and wonders. In 1271, after leaving the port of Ayas on the Mediterranean coast, the Polo family crossed the limit of the world known to Europeans. A journey that would take 3.5 years awaited them. It was not a trip in the modern sense of the word. It was a daily struggle for survival on a route littered with the bones of those who did not make it. The Silk Road was not a single path. It was a network of dangerous trails, crossing the most inhospiting landscapes on the planet, where merchants were stalked by bandits, diseases, and extreme weather. The first test was Persia. The land, once flourishing, had been devastated by the Mongol invasion a few decades earlier. Marco Polo described ruined cities and the fear that reigned on the roads. Here they faced mortal danger for the first time. Near the city of Kerman, Their caravan was attacked by a band of Karauna's highwaymen. They were ruthless marauders who, according to legends, knew how to summon darkness through witchcraft. They probably used dust storms for camouflage. In the thick fog and dust, the caravan scattered. Most of Polo's companions were captured and killed on the spot or sold into slavery. Marco, his father, and his uncle managed to escape by a miracle and take refuge behind the walls of the nearest fortified city. That was the first lesson for the young Venetian. Outside of Europe, a person's life was worth nothing. Initially, the Polos planned to reach China by sea. They went down to the Persian Gulf, to the port of Hormuz, hoping to board a ship. But upon seeing the local vessels, Marco was horrified. They were fragile boats, sewn together with coconut fiber ropes, without a single iron nail. His father and uncle, experienced merchants, decided that sailing in such ships across the Indian Ocean was pure suicide. A fateful decision was made, to turn north and go to China by land, across the roof of the world. The path crossed the territory of present-day Afghanistan. In the mountains of the Hindu Kush, young Marco, unaccustomed to the harsh climate and bad water, fell seriously ill. Historians debate what it was: malaria, typhus, or tuberculosis. The illness was so serious that the expedition was forced to stop for an entire year in the Badakhshan region. For Marco, this year of forced inactivity became a time of deep immersion in Oriental culture. While he slowly recovered breathing the pure mountain air, he studied local customs and legends. He described the famous rubies of Badakhshan, spinels, and the lapis lazuli that was mined in those mountains. He listened to the stories of the locals, who claimed they descended from Alexander the Great himself and his wife Roxana. It was here that Marco began to transform from a simple traveler into a researcher and ethnographer who noticed and recorded everything, from the methods of extracting precious stones to the habits of local horses. Once recovered, Marco and his companions continued their journey and ascended the Pamir Mountains. The locals called this place the Roof of the World. They walked across high mountain plateaus at an altitude of over 13,000 feet. Marco noticed with surprise that no birds lived there and that fires burned dimly and gave off no heat, making it impossible to cook food properly. This was perhaps the first scientific observation in history made by a European about the effect of lack of oxygen at high altitudes. Right there, he saw and described giant mountain sheep with enormous twisted horns. Centuries later, when European zoologists confirmed the existence of these animals, they would name them Ovis ammon polii, the Marco Polo sheep, in his honor. However, to his contemporaries, these stories sounded like just another fairy tale. Coming down from the freezing heights of the Pamir, the travelers found themselves facing the most terrible obstacle of the entire journey: the Taklamakan Desert and the adjacent Gobi Desert. The name Taklamakan is often translated as "you go in and you do not come out." It was an ocean of sand, where the heat of the day burned your lungs and the cold of the night chilled you to the bone. Crossing this desert took a month. Marco left us one of the most terrifying and mystical descriptions in his book. He wrote that this desert was inhabited by evil spirits who desired the doom of travelers. If a person fell behind the caravan, even by a single step, they began to hear voices. Sometimes, these voices called them by name, imitating the voices of their friends or family members, luring them off the path, deep into the sands, where certain death by thirst awaited them. By day, you often hear the rhythm of drums and sounds of various musical instruments, especially when the wind blows, he wrote. Today we know it is the phenomenon of singing sands, caused by the friction of sand grains against each other. But to the medieval traveler, that was the devil's magic. In order not to go mad and not to get lost, the caravan drivers stayed strictly together, hung bells on the necks of the animals, and at night placed signs indicating the direction. It was a march through psychological hell. After crossing the desert, they entered lands inhabited by Uyghurs and Tanguts. Here Marco first encountered customs that shocked his Christian conscience, but which he recorded with the impartiality of a reporter. He described hospitable prostitution in the city of Kamul, where hosts gave their wives to travelers, considering it a deed pleasing to God. He told with amazement about a material that does not burn in fire, asbestos, which the locals mined in the mountains, calling it salamander wool. In Europe, They believed that the salamander was a fire spirit, but Marco Polo rationally explained that it was a mineral. Little by little, the landscape changed. The wild desert gave way to cultivated fields, roads, and cities. After 3.5 years of an exhausting journey, having covered over 7,400 miles, the Venetians, ragged, aged, and tired, reached the borders of the Yuan Empire. They had reached China. They were not received as vagabonds. Messengers informed the Great Khan about the return of the Polo brothers, and an honor guard was sent to meet them, 40 days' travel away. They were taken to the Khan's summer residence, the legendary Shangdu, Xanadu. The moment of the meeting was the culmination of their odyssey. 17-year-old Marco, who had left home as a boy and arrived as a man, saw for the first time the person who ruled half the world. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was seated on a dais in a pavilion made of gold-covered cane, which could be disassembled and moved anywhere. Niccolo and Maffeo prostrated themselves. "Who is this young man who comes with you?" asked the Khan. "Sire, this is my son and your servant," answered Niccolo. Kublai, who liked the young man's lively and intelligent look, said, "Welcome." For Marco Polo, the path of bones ended and life at court began. He entered a world that, in its level of development, wealth, and technology, surpassed Europe by centuries. He saw things that, by describing them, doomed him to the fame of the greatest liar in history, because believing in them was impossible. Paper money, coal, gigantic cities, and a postal service. All this awaited him ahead. The arrival at the Great Khan's summer residence, the city of Shangdu, known in Western culture as Xanadu, was for the Venetians the moment of transition to another reality. If their journey had been a path through the hell of deserts and mountains, Xanadu presented itself to them as an earthly paradise created by the will of a single man. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was a completely different kind of ruler from his fearsome grandfather. If Genghis Khan had been a warrior in the saddle who despised cities and wanted to turn the world into a pasture, Kublai was a builder, emperor, the first Mongol to become a full-fledged emperor of China and founder of the Yuan dynasty. He united within himself the fierce military power of the steppe people with the millennial wisdom and administrative machinery of Chinese civilization. Marco Polo described with amazement the structure of the residence. He saw an enormous marble palace whose wings were painted with gold and images of beasts and birds. But what struck him most was the combination of a sedentary and nomadic lifestyle. Next to the stone palace stood a gigantic collapsible bamboo pavilion covered in lacquer to protect it from the rain. This pavilion was supported by 200 silk ropes. It was a symbol that the master of the world, even while living among silks, had not forgotten his roots. The park around the palace was enclosed by a wall and filled with wild beasts. Marco described how the Khan left his home not on horseback, but in a special wooden room installed on the backs of 4 elephants, from where he shot tigers and deer without interrupting his conversation with his advisors. To a 13th century European, accustomed to the cramped and dirty castles of feudal lords, such a scale of luxury and comfort seemed like something out of another world. But the real cultural shock did not await Marco in the architecture, but in the technologies and social organization of the Yuan Empire. He faced things his mind refused to understand, and for which, in his native Italian language, names did not even exist. The first and greatest impact was the money. In Europe at that time, the value of a coin was determined by the weight of the gold or silver it was made of. The idea that a piece of paper could be worth the same as a bag of gold seemed absurd. Marco Polo dedicated an entire chapter to the description of this phenomenon, which he sincerely considered a form of state alchemy. He described the production process in detail, like a spy, how they took the bark of the mulberry tree, soaked it, turned it into pulp, and pressed it into sheets of paper. But that only became money after they stamped the bright red imperial seal on the sheet. By the present, the Great Khan orders, read the inscription. Marco was astonished that this paper was accepted throughout the empire, under penalty of death, and that with it, you could buy all the treasures. He saw the prototype of the modern financial system, based on state credit, a concept that Europe would only arrive at 400 years later. The great Khan possesses the secret of the alchemists to perfection. He wrote, not understanding that the secret lay not in magic, but in absolute power and trust in the state. The second wonder was the black stones. Marco wrote, in this country, there are black stones that are mined in the mountains as if they were veins. They burn like firewood and hold the fire better than firewood. If you light them in the evening, they will burn all night until morning. He was describing coal. In 13th century Europe, people heated exclusively with wood. The forests of Venice and other cities were being rapidly cut down. China, which had faced the ecological crisis of deforestation centuries earlier, had switched to fossil fuel. For Marco, who had never seen coal, a stone that burned was a violation of the laws of nature, another proof that he had fallen into a world of wonders. The third shock was the organization. Traveling on behalf of the Khan, Marco was amazed by the road system and the postal service, which the Mongols called Yam. It was not just a network of messengers, as in the time of Genghis Khan. It was a gigantic infrastructure. The roads were planted with trees, so the traveler would not get lost. Every 25 to 30 miles, there were Yam stations with luxurious hotels where up to 400 fresh horses were always ready. Marco calculated that over 200,000 horses participated in the system. He wrote that thanks to this system, the Khan received fresh fruits or news of a rebellion thousands of miles away in just a couple of days. The speed of information transmission in Kublai's empire was greater than in Europe until the invention of the telegraph. But the grandest impression, the one that completely overturned his worldview, were the cities. Venice, with its population of 100,000 people, was considered a megalopolis in Europe. But when Marco Polo saw Khanbaliq, present-day Beijing, or Kinsay, present-day Hangzhou, he was speechless. About Hangzhou, which he called the City of Heaven, Marco wrote with almost religious awe. He claimed that in the city there were 12,000 stone bridges under which large ships could pass, that there were paved streets, sewer systems, public baths with hot water, fire brigades, and police patrolling the streets at night. He described a population of 1.5 million people. European readers of his book would later laugh at these figures, considering them the ravings of a madman. They simply could not believe that somewhere at the end of the world there existed a civilization that surpassed their own as much as Rome surpassed barbarian villages. But modern archaeologists and historians have confirmed it. Marco was not lying. Hangzhou was truly the largest and most developed city in the world in the 13th century. Kublai Khan himself appears in Marco's description as the ideal philosopher-ruler that Plato dreamed of and that Marcus Aurelius tried to be. He was incredibly tolerant. Buddhists, Taoists, Muslims, Christians, Nestorians, and Jews lived peacefully together in his court. Marco describes how, on major holidays, the Khan asked representatives of all religions to pray for him to their gods. For a Europe torn apart by the Crusades and religious intolerance, where dissent was punished by burning at the stake, this image of religious peace seemed an unthinkable heresy. Marco Polo also noted the Khan's social policy. He wrote with surprise that the emperor exempted provinces suffering from bad weather, from taxes, and opened state granaries to distribute bread to the poor. He cares for his people like a father for his children, noted the Venetian, accustomed to European kings, caring mainly about collecting taxes for the next war. In this astonishing world, young Marco Polo lived for 17 years. Thanks to his talent for languages, he learned Mongolian, Turkic, Persian, and possibly some Chinese, and with his sharp observational skills, he built a brilliant career. Kublai, who did not trust the Chinese officials of the country he had conquered, gladly appointed foreigners with colored eyes, as the Chinese called them, to positions. Marco became the eyes and ears of the emperor. The Khan sent him on inspection tours to the most remote provinces, to Burma, Vietnam, southern India, and Tibet. Upon returning, Marco did not give the Khan dry reports on taxes, but lively stories about the customs, strange animals, and habits of the locals. Kublai liked that sharp mind. Marco saw crocodiles, which he called giant snakes with legs. He saw rhinos, which, to his disappointment, he mistook for unicorns, pointing out that they were ugly and liked to wallow in the mud, nothing like the elegant beasts of European legends. He saw people mining diamonds with the help of eagles and tattooed tribal warriors. He became a citizen of the world, for whom Venice turned into a distant and half-forgotten memory. He was part of the elite of the most powerful empire in human history. But time passed. Kublai Khan was getting old. Marco, his father, and his uncle understood. They were outsiders. Their position, their wealth, and their very lives depended solely on the personal protection of the old emperor. As soon as Kublai died, his heirs or his Chinese enemies might get rid of the foreign favorites. They had to flee. But the Khan did not want to let them go. They were too useful. The POLO family found themselves in a golden cage, trapped in a paradise that could turn into hell at any moment. During his 17 years of service in the court of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo played the role of a special emissary. The emperor valued him not for his administrative talents, but for his eyes. The Mongol generals, returning from their campaigns, only reported on the number of dead enemies and captured loot. Marco, on the other hand, brought back stories. He was the first European anthropologist and ethnographer, although such words did not exist yet. He ventured to the wildest frontier provinces of the empire, to Yunnan, Tibet, Burma, Vietnam, and India, to describe to the Khan how his new subjects lived. And what he saw turned the conscience of a medieval Christian upside down. One of the most shocking topics in his notes was the sexual customs of the peoples of the East. To a 13th century Catholic, raised in strict morality, where extramarital affairs were a deadly sin, what he saw seemed like a devilish obsession. Marco described the province of Kamel in detail, present-day Hami in Xinjiang. The inhabitants of these places were incredibly hospitable, but their hospitality crossed all imaginable boundaries. When a traveler arrived at a house, the host would order his wife, daughters, and sisters to fulfill any desire of the guest, while he himself left the home for several days, leaving the stranger as the absolute master of his house and his wife. The women, according to Marco, were beautiful, cheerful, and very skilled in carnal pleasures. The most amazing thing is that the locals saw no sin or shame in this. On the contrary, they believed that such generosity pleased their idols, and that thanks to it, the gods sent them abundant harvests and protected their livestock. Marco recorded a historical anecdote. When Mungka Khan, Kublai's predecessor, tried to ban this shameful custom by decree, the inhabitants of Kamul sent him a delegation begging him to overturn the ban, since after it, their lands suffered poor harvests. The Khan, being pragmatic, waved a hand and allowed them to live in the old way. In Tibet, which Marco described as a land of sorcerers and wild beasts, he encountered an even stranger custom. There, no one wanted to marry a virgin. A woman who had no experience with men before marriage was considered incomplete and unpleasing to the gods. Mothers would bring their daughters to the merchant caravans and offer them to the travelers. The young woman who managed to gather the greatest amount of tokens or gifts from different lovers was considered the most enviable bride, as this proved her attractiveness and the favor of the stars. For Marco Polo, this was a world turned upside down. No less horror and admiration were caused by their religious practices. In the province of Karajan, present-day Yunnan, and on the borders of Tibet, he saw people who spoke with demons. He described lamas and astrologers who had power over the weather. According to him, when clouds gathered over the Khan's palace, these sorcerers, standing on the roof, could force the storm to dodge the palace with their spells, so that it rained all around, but the sun shone over the emperor's residence. He described their dark rituals, the use of human skulls as cups and bones for musical instruments. To a European, this was black magic, but Marco noted with surprise that the great Khan himself treated these people with respect and even fear. As a merchant and observer, he could not overlook the exotic wildlife. It was Marco Polo who killed one of the most beautiful European myths, the myth of the unicorn. In Europe, they believed the unicorn was an elegant white horse with a horn on its forehead that could only be caught by a virgin. Marco saw the unicorn in the forests of Sumatra and Burma and was deeply disappointed. He wrote, "It is a horrible beast. It has hair like a buffalo and feet like an elephant. Its horn is black and thick, in the middle of its forehead. It likes to wallow in the mud and slime. It does not look at all like how we describe it in our countries. Marco Polo, without knowing it, gave the first accurate description in European literature of the Asian rhinoceros. His realism destroyed the fairy tale. He also described giant snakes that live in the southern rivers and are capable of swallowing a whole man. They had 2 short legs, with claws like a lion. He was probably describing crocodiles or caimans, exaggerating their size. He thoroughly documented how locals hunted them, setting traps with sharp blades on their paths down to the water. But what amazed him most was that the gall of these monsters was considered a precious medicine worth its weight in gold. Traveling through India, Marco encountered the caste of Brahmins, or yogis, who walked completely naked, despising material goods. He was amazed by their philosophy of non-violence, ahimsa. They did not kill any living being, not even insects. They carried little brooms so as not to accidentally step on an ant, and they ate no meat. They believed every creature had a soul. To the Venetian, used to meat and wine, this asceticism seemed incomprehensible, but he noted with respect their longevity and robust health. Right there, in India, he described the trade of pearl divers. He told how divers went down to the ocean floor, risking their lives against sharks. And here again, business and magic intertwined. Merchants hired special sorcerers, shark charmers, who with the help of mantras blinded the predators during the day for the duration of the gathering. At night, the spell was lifted and the sea became dangerous again. But perhaps the most influential myth that Marco Polo brought to Europe was the story of a country he himself never visited, Japan. He called it Cipangu, the Golden Island of Japan. Based on the stories of Chinese and Mongol sailors, he described Cipangu as an island in the Eastern Ocean, where there was so much gold, they covered the roofs of their palaces with it, just as in Europe they covered them with lead or copper. He told of the local ruler's palace, whose floors were paved with gold slabs 2 fingers thick, and of pink pearls placed in the mouths of the dead. It was precisely these lines about the Golden Island of Cipangu, read 200 years later by an ambitious Genoese man, that would become fatal for history. Christopher Columbus would sail west not to discover America, but to find that very golden island described by Marco Polo. The Venetians' mistake, exaggerating the riches of Japan, would lead to the discovery of the New World. Marco Polo's book became an encyclopedia of the East. He described the paper money that replaced gold. He described the stones that burn, coal, which allowed the Chinese to take hot baths 3 times a week, an unthinkable frequency for a European. He described asbestos, the cloth that does not burn in fire, and the oil that gushed like a fountain from the earth in the Baku region, which they used for lighting and curing skin diseases on camels. He saw the world not as a collection of miracles created by God, but as an enormous and complex system of peoples, customs, goods, and technologies. He stopped being just a Venetian. He became the first citizen of a global world. But the more he learned, the more he understood how small, poor, and ignorant his native Europe was, compared to this giant, brilliant, terrifying, and magnificent Asia. His 17 years of service were coming to an end. Kublai Khan had become a decrepit old man suffering from gout and obesity. His wife Chabi and his beloved heir son had died. The empire was beginning to creak at the seams. Anti-foreign sentiments were growing at court. Chinese officials hated the colored-eyed barbarians who held high positions. Marco, his father, and his uncle understood. When their protector died, death awaited them. They had to flee while they still had the power of their golden paisas. But the Khan, who valued their stories and honesty, refused to let them go. They became hostages to their own success. Around the year 1290, the Polo family's situation at the Great Khan's court became desperate. They were fabulously wealthy, respected, and pampered by power, but they were prisoners. Kublai Khan, who was already over 70 years old, deteriorated before their eyes. He suffered from gout, depression, and obesity, finding comfort only in food and wine. Marco, his father Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo perfectly understood the political mechanics of the Oriental court. As soon as the old protector died, the struggle for power would begin. In that struggle, the foreigners, the colored-eyed favorites, envied by Chinese officials and Mongol warlords, would be the first victims. Their riches would be confiscated and their heads cut off. They had to leave while Kublai was still alive, while their golden paisa, which granted immunity, still had the force of law. Several times, they asked the Khan to let them go back home, to Venice, claiming they wanted to die in their homeland. But Kublai refused every time. He had grown fond of them, especially Marco, and didn't want to lose his best storytellers and servants. It seemed they were doomed to perish along with their master. Salvation arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a diplomatic incident. Arghun Khan, ruler of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state in Persia, and Kublai's great-nephew, had lost his favorite wife. Before she died, she left as her final wish that her place be taken only by a woman from her own Mongol lineage. Arghun sent ambassadors to China, to Kublai, with a request to find him a new bride. Kublai chose a beautiful 17-year-old princess named Kököçin, the Blue Princess. The ambassadors set off with the bride back to Persia by land, along the Silk Road. But in Central Asia, another internal war broke out among the Khans. The road was blocked by rebel armies. The ambassadors were forced to return to the Chinese capital, Khanbalik. Only one way remained, by sea. But the Mongols were people of the steppe. They feared the sea and knew nothing of navigation. The Persian ambassadors, learning that Venetians lived at court, experienced sailors who had already voyaged to India, began begging the Khan to entrust the POLO family specifically with taking the princess to Persia by sea. Kublai reluctantly agreed. It was the POLO's last chance. The Khan equipped a grand expedition. The fleet consisted of 14 giant, four-masted junks. On these ships, besides the crew, were housed the princess's retinue, the ambassadors, the guards, and the POLO family. Some 600 people in total, not counting the sailors. The holds were filled with provisions for 2 years and untold treasures. The princess's dowry and farewell gifts from the Khan for European monarchs and the Pope. Before setting sail, Kublai handed them the golden paisas one last time, granting them absolute powers and protection throughout the territory of the Mongol Empire. In early 1292, the fleet left the port of Zaitun, present-day Quanzhou in southern China. A voyage began that turned into one of the worst maritime nightmares in history. The first months of sailing passed relatively calmly. They reached the shores of Champa, Vietnam, and then rounded the Malay Peninsula. But when they approached the island of Sumatra, which Marco called Little Java, their luck turned. Due to the changing monsoon winds, the fleet was forced to stop and wait for better weather. This stop in Sumatra lasted for 5 long and tortuous months. They landed on the coast, but the jungle hid deadly dangers. Marco described the locals as savages who devoured people like beasts. It is not known if they were actual cannibals or simply hostile tribes. But the threat was so great that the Polos ordered deep trenches dug around their camp and wooden fortifications built. 2,000 people lived under siege in a humid and suffocating tropical climate, afraid to wander far from the shore. It was here that the catastrophe began. The unusual weather, tropical fevers, malaria, dysentery, and possibly scurvy began taking lives. The supplies of fresh water and food were rotting. People were dying by the dozens. The luxurious diplomatic mission turned into a death camp. Marco, Niccolo, and Maffeo survived, probably thanks to their immunity and experience, but for the Mongols and Chinese, unaccustomed to the tropics, that was hell. When the wind finally changed and the fleet, already decimated, moved on, the horrors did not end. Crossing the Indian Ocean was long and harsh. Storms scattered the ships. Marco Polo, true to his explorer nature, kept taking notes even under these conditions. He described Ceylon, Sri Lanka, as an island where on top of a mountain is Adam's tomb, Adam's Peak, although Buddhists told him it was the footprint of Buddha. He described Indian yogis, shark charmers, and the extraction of diamonds. But his notes from this period become increasingly dry and gloomy. Death was everywhere. Of the 600 noble passengers who boarded in China, only 18 reached Persia. Almost all of them died. The ambassadors, the women, the children, the guards. But As if protected by some miracle, the three Venetians survived: Marco, his father, and his uncle. And, most surprisingly, the fragile Princess Cocokin survived. 2 years after setting sail, in 1293 or 1294, the battered remnants of the fleet reached the port of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. But here, a new blow awaited them. While they were sailing, Arghun Khan, the princess's betrothed, had died. Chaos reigned in Persia, and there was a struggle for power. The princess turned out to be an unnecessary pawn in a strange country. The Venetians, faithful to their duty, did not abandon her. Risking their lives, they took Kukuchin to the son of the deceased Khan, Ghazan, who eventually took her as his wife. Marco describes a touching farewell scene. The princess cried when parting from them. During the years of that terrible journey, the Venetians had become her only family, her protectors. Their duty fulfilled, the Polos were free. But then news caught up with them that changed everything. Rumors arrived in Persia, and then official confirmation. The great Khan Kublai had died. For the world, this meant the end of an era. For the Polo family, it meant that their golden ticket, their paisa, instantly lost its magic power. It was now just a piece of precious metal. No one was obliged to give them horses, food, or guards anymore. The protection that had safeguarded them for 20 years vanished. They were left alone in the center of Asia, loaded with immense riches that now became a deadly bait. Every bandit, every local petty king, dreamed of seizing the treasures of the deceased Khan's favorites. They had to return home to Europe urgently, but the safe road through the Mongol Empire was closed. The disintegration of the great state into rival factions and khanates was beginning. The Polos had to choose a difficult and tortuous route. Accompanied by a small detachment hired with their own money, they advanced north toward Trabzon, on the Black Sea coast. This last stretch of the journey was perhaps the most dangerous. They were ambushed. Local rulers extorted massive bribes from them. In Trebizond, Byzantine officials confiscated part of their merchandise, some 4,000 gold florins, a gigantic sum. But they were experienced merchants. The most valuable stones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, they sewed into the linings of their old traveling tunics, dirty and soaked with sweat and salt. On the outside, they looked like vagrants who had nothing to lose. In 1295, 24 years after their departure, a galley with 3 strange men entered the Venetian lagoon. They spoke their native dialect with difficulty, mixing words with Mongol and Turkic phrases. Their faces were burned by the desert sun and ocean winds. No one was expecting them. They had long been presumed dead. Relatives had occupied their house and divided up their property. When they knocked on the doors of their palazzo, people simply did not open. The servants mistook them for beggars. Thus ended the grandest journey of the Middle Ages. But the most important test, making the world believe what they had seen, still lay ahead. In 1295, when a galley with 3 strangers docked at the pier of Venice, the city was busy with its usual affairs, trade, intrigues, and preparations for another war against Genoa. No one paid attention to the 3 ragged men, tanned the color of ebony, who stepped ashore. They looked like Tartars or Persians. Their clothes were dirty, greasy, and sewn in a rough Asian style. They spoke the Venetian dialect, but found words with difficulty, dragging their vowels strangely and constantly mixing in phrases in Mongolian. When they arrived at their native home, the Polo Palace, in the San Giovanni Crisostomo neighborhood, a cold reception awaited them. The servants and relatives, who had long ago divided the property of the deceased, refused to let them pass the threshold. They took them for impostors, vagrants trying to pass themselves off as family members missing for a long time. 24 years is a lifetime. Marco left as a young man and returned as a 40-year-old man. His father and uncle had become very old men. Their faces, lined with wrinkles and scars, were the map of their sufferings. To prove their identity and regain their position in society, the Polo brothers and Marco decided to put on a show worthy of Kublai Khan himself. This story, recorded by the Italian humanist Giovanni Battista Ramusio, became one of the most famous legends of Venice. They invited all their relatives, friends, and notable people of the city to a lavish banquet. The guests went mostly out of curiosity, to laugh at the crazy imposters. But what happened next shut them up. During dinner, the hosts changed clothes several times. First they came out in long crimson satin tunics, then they took them off, and to the horror of the guests, cut the expensive fabrics into pieces right there and handed them out to the servants. Then they dressed in crimson damask garments and cut those up again. Finally, they came out in velvet cloaks. It was a display of insane and oriental extravagance, unheard of for the stingy Venetians. But the climax came at the end of the dinner. Marco Polo brought from the next room those very same dirty, coarse, and patched travelling robes in which they had arrived in the city and which everyone had mocked. He took a knife and began to unstitch the seams and linings. And then a cascade of fire and light spilled onto the table. Rubies the size of pigeon eggs, emeralds, sapphires, diamonds, pearls, precious stones fell from the dirty rags, glittering in the candlelight. The guests were struck dumb. That was not simple wealth. It was a fortune that could buy half of Venice. In a second, the attitude toward them changed. From vagrants, they transformed into the most respected citizens of the Republic. The relatives, who an hour ago did not recognize them, rushed to embrace them with tears in their eyes. The Polo family was restored to their rights. Marco became a celebrity. Young Venetians went to his house to hear his stories about the East. And Marco told them. He spoke of palaces with roofs of pure gold, of cities where millions of people lived, of fleets of thousands of ships, of the great Khan's income that was counted in millions of gold coins. But the more he told, the less they believed him. To 13th century Europeans, the world was small, poor, and understandable. They knew that in the East lived people with dog heads and only one leg. They knew the biblical stories. But Marco's stories about a civilization that surpassed the Christian world in wealth, population, and technology simply did not fit in their heads. It sounded like an insult. How could pagans be richer and smarter than Christians? The Venetians listened to him with a smile, the way you listen to a talented storyteller. They didn't believe in paper money. How can you pay with paper? They didn't believe in black stones that burn. Stone doesn't burn. They didn't believe the size of the cities, because the word million constantly appeared in his stories, a number rarely used at that time. They gave him a mocking nickname, Messer Milioni, Mr. Million. People started calling his house the Corte del Milione, the Court of the Million. It was not a nickname of respect, but of irony. To them, he was a harmless fantasist, the Baron Munchausen of his time. Marco suffered from this mistrust. He had brought back not only stories, but proof. Silks, seeds of rare plants, Chinese art objects, even a slave woman he brought from the East and to whom he would later give freedom in his will. But people saw only what they wanted to see. They saw curiosities, but refused to see a great civilization behind them. He felt like a stranger in his own city. His body had returned to Venice, but his soul remained in China at the Khan's court, where he was valued for the truth and not mocked as a liar. However, the peaceful life of the rich merchant telling anecdotes did not last long. Venice was in a permanent state of war with its main commercial competitor, the Republic of Genoa. It was a struggle for control of the Mediterranean Sea. In 1296, the war flared up with new force. Marco Polo, like a true patriot and wealthy nobleman, could not stay on the sidelines. With his own money, he armed a war galley, equipped it, and personally took his place on the command deck. He was not just a merchant. He was a man of action who had crossed deserts and seas, survived pirates and cannibals. The war with the Genoese seemed to him a noble cause. In September 1298, the fleets of Venice and Genoa met in the decisive Battle of Curzola, present-day Korčula in Croatia. It was one of the largest naval battles of the Middle Ages. The Venetians, under the command of Admiral Andrea Dandolo, made a tactical error. The Genoese fleet, applying a cunning maneuver and using a reserve hidden behind the islands, totally defeated the Venetians. It was a catastrophe. The Venetian fleet was annihilated. Admiral Dandolo, to avoid being taken prisoner and escaping shame, smashed his head against the mast of his own ship. Thousands of Venetians died. Marco Polo fought bravely. He, the man who survived the storms of the Indian Ocean, found himself in the center of a bloody massacre in the Adriatic. His galley was surrounded and boarded. Marco Polo was taken prisoner. He was chained and, along with thousands of other Venetian captives, sent to Genoa. His journey, which began with freedom and the search for wonders, ended in a damp, dark cell of a Genoese prison. It seemed like the end. Rich merchant, friend of the emperor, traveler, he was now simply a prisoner with no rights, awaiting ransom or death by disease. But that very prison was the place where his immortality was born. Fate, which guided him across all of Asia, prepared an encounter that would change the history of literature and geography. In that prison, he was not alone. Confined in the Genoese prison of the Palazzo San Giorgio, Marco Polo could have fallen into despair. For a man accustomed to the immensity of the steppe and the luxury of the imperial court, being locked in a narrow cell was torture. But fate, which had guided him across all of Asia, played its decisive role here too. In that very prison, among hundreds of other prisoners of war, was another man, Rustichello de Pisa. Rustichello was not a merchant or a warrior. He was a professional writer, author of popular chivalric romances about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It was the meeting of two opposites that sparked a flame. Marco Polo had unique and incredible memories, but he was a man of action, not of words. He spoke a mix of languages and possessed no literary gift. Rustichello had no plots, but he had a brilliant pen and the ability to turn dry facts into a fascinating epic. They teamed up. Marco possibly asked his father to send him his travel notes from Venice, although many historians believe he dictated from memory, and he began to narrate. And Rustichello wrote, but he did not merely take dictation. He processed Marco's stories, adding literary flourishes, drama, and the epic style characteristic of chivalric romances. That is why the book begins with words more fitting for a fairy tale. Emperors and kings, dukes and marquises, take this book and have others read it. Thus was born the Book of the Marvels of the World, or Il Milione. It was written in Franco-Venetian, which at that time was a language of international literature, making it immediately accessible to all educated Europe. The book became a sensation. It spread with incredible speed. Even though the printing press had not yet been invented, hundreds of scribes throughout Europe copied it by hand. It was translated into Latin, Italian, German, but its popularity was peculiar. People did not read it as a geographical guide, but as a fantasy novel. The descriptions of giant rock birds that could lift an elephant, of men with dog heads, which Marco mentioned as legends, heard from others, and of black stones that burned, were perceived as entertaining tall tales. In 1299, Venice and Genoa signed peace. Marco Polo was released. He returned home, to Venice, no longer just as a rich merchant, but as a celebrity. He was 45 years old. He married the Venetian Donata Badua, who gave him 3 daughters, Fantina, Bellela, and Moretta. The rest of his life, another 25 years, Marco lived as a respectable, albeit slightly strange, Venetian patrician. He managed his businesses, litigated with relatives over money, lent money. He became an ordinary, earthly bourgeois. But the shadow of his great journey was always present. Venetians kept calling him Messer Million, and according to legend, during carnivals, clowns would dress up as Marco Polo to tell the public the most ridiculous and funny stories, parodying his book. For Marco himself, this mistrust was a tragedy. He knew he told the truth. He knew the world was enormous and rich, and that Europe was just its small, dark corner. He kept his treasures, the gold Pisa, the robe in which he returned, the ring given by the Khan, as proofs of the reality of his past. In his will there is a touching clause. He granted freedom to his Tartar slave, a Mongol named Peter, who served him faithfully for many years and whom he brought with him from Asia. It was his last gesture of gratitude toward that world he had left behind. On January 8th, 1324, at the age of 69, Marco Polo lay on his deathbed. The doctor, the priest, and friends gathered around him begged him, for the salvation of his soul, to renounce the lies written in his book and eliminate from it everything that was invention. Marco, gathering his last ounce of strength, sat up and spoke his famous last words. "I have not told half of what I saw, because I knew they would not believe me anyway. With these words, the great traveler passed away. He died believing he had failed, that his knowledge would go with him. But he was wrong. His book began to live its own life. Little by little, as other travelers and missionaries began to penetrate the East, it was discovered that Marco Polo's tales were true. It turned out that China was truly enormous, that they used coal and paper money there, that Japan, Sipangu, really existed. The greatest influence of the Book of the Marvels was on cartography. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375 was drawn based precisely on Marco Polo's data. For the first time, he gave Europeans an idea of the real dimensions of Asia, showing that it didn't end right behind Jerusalem, but stretched for thousands of miles. But the most important and fateful effect was produced by the book almost 200 years after the author's death. At the end of the 15th century, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus carefully studied a copy of Marco Polo's book. In the margins of that book, there are over 70 annotations made in Columbus's hand. Columbus was obsessed with Marco's stories about the gold of Sipangu, Japan, and the riches of the Khan. He believed Marco Polo, but he made a mistake. He also believed that Asia was so enormous that one could reach it easily by sailing west across the Atlantic. Based on Polo's data, Columbus decided that the ocean between Europe and Asia was narrow. If Marco Polo had not written his book, or if he had not exaggerated the riches of the East, Columbus might never have decided to undertake his voyage. The great Venetian, without knowing it, became the godfather of the discovery of America. He sought a path to the East, but inspired the discovery of the West. Marco Polo's legacy is not just a route on a map. He was the first citizen of the world. He was the first European who could look at another culture, not looking down on them, not as barbarians or pagans, but with respect and sincere interest. He showed that the world is diverse. He built the first bridge over the abyss of ignorance that separated East and West. Today we know he was not lying. He really walked the path of bones, saw the court of Kublai, and served the Yuan Empire. His million is not a million inventions, but a million discoveries. The man they considered a storyteller turned out to be the most truthful historian of his time. And when we look at the map of the world today, we see it that way largely thanks to the eyes of a Venetian merchant who was not afraid to cross the horizon.